War of the Worlds Retelling Chapter 16, Part 2. As we approached the meeting point of the lane and road, it felt like riding into the smoke of a fire. The crowd was roaring like a fire, and the dust was hot and strong smelling. Up ahead, a villa was burning, and thick black smoke was billowing across the road, adding to the chaos. We saw two men pass us, followed by a weeping woman carrying a heavy bundle. A lost retriever dog with a hanging tongue circled around us, looking scared and miserable, but fled when my brother threatened it. Looking down the road towards London, we could see a chaotic stream of dirty, rushing people squeezed in between the villas on either side. As they approached the corner, their individual features became clearer, only to merge together again as they receded into the distance, swallowed up by a cloud of dust. Go on, the voices cried urgently. The crowd was pressing so tightly that one man's hands were on the back of another. I stood at the head of the pony, unable to resist the pull of the commotion. Edgware and Chalk Farm had been chaotic, but this was a mass of people in motion unlike any other. There was no specific group or character to it. The figures streamed past the corner, their backs to us. Those on foot struggled along the margins, threatened by the wheels of the vehicles, stumbling and blundering into one another. The carts and carriages were packed together tightly, leaving little space for the swifter and more impatient vehicles that would dart forward now and then, scattering people against the fences and gates of the nearby villas. The urgency of the crowd was palpable, and it seemed to be moving as one entity. "Let's hurry," people shouted. "They're coming." In one of the carts, a blind man dressed in a Salvation Army uniform was waving his arms and shouting, "Eternity! Eternity!" His voice was so loud that my brother could still hear him even after he disappeared into the dust. Some of the people driving the carts whipped their horses and argued with other drivers. Others sat silently, looking miserable. Some were thirsty and chewed on their hands, while others lay on the floor of their carts. The horses were foaming at the mouth, and their eyes were bloodshot. There were so many vehicles on the road that my brother couldn't count them all: cabs, carriages, delivery trucks, and wagons. He saw a mail cart, a street cleaner's cart with a sign saying Vestry of St. Pancras, and a huge timber wagon filled with rough-looking men. A brewery wagon passed by, its wheels stained with fresh blood. I heard voices shouting, "Clear the way! Clear the way!" Then I heard echoes of eternity, eternity, coming from the road. As I looked around, I saw many women walking by, looking sad and tired. They were dressed nicely, but their clothes were covered in dust and their faces were smeared with tears. Some of them had children who were crying and stumbling along with them. Some men were walking with them, some of them helpful while others seemed angry and aggressive. I also saw some people who seemed like outcasts from the streets, dressed in ragged black clothes, with wide eyes and loud, foul language. There were also some sturdy workmen struggling to make their way through the crowd, looking tired and unkempt, dressed like clerks or shop workers. I even noticed a wounded soldier and some men wearing the clothes of railway porters. One man was even wearing a nightshirt with a coat thrown over it and looked very wretched. I saw a large group of people with different backgrounds and experiences, but they all shared some things in common. They had fear and pain on their faces, and I could sense their underlying fear. Suddenly, there was commotion up the road as people argued over a spot in a wagon. Everyone in the group picked up their pace. Even a man who looked scared and weak, his knees almost giving out, was suddenly energized for a moment. The group was affected by the heat and dust, and their skin was dry, lips black and cracked. They were all tired, thirsty, and had sore feet. I could hear them arguing, blaming each other, and groaning from exhaustion. Most of their voices were hoarse and weak. However, they all had one common chant: "Way, way, the Martians are coming." I noticed that not many people stopped and moved away from the huge crowd. The lane slanted towards the main road and looked like it came from London, but it was misleading. People seemed to gather into the lane, almost like a whirlpool. Some weak individuals pushed their way out of the crowd, resting for a brief moment before diving back in. Further down the lane, I saw a man with a bare leg wrapped in bloody rags lying on the ground with two friends tending to him. He was fortunate to have friends to care for him. Then, an elderly man with a gray military mustache and a dirty black coat sat beside me, took off his boot, removed a pebble, and hobbled away. Shortly after, a young girl around 8 or 9 years old, all by herself, came near me and cried, "I can't keep going. I can't keep going." My brother was stunned but quickly regained his senses when he saw a young girl cry. He picked her up and spoke softly to her, carrying her over to Miss Elphinstone. As soon as my brother held her, the girl stopped crying and became very still, almost like she was scared. Suddenly, a woman in the crowd started shouting "Ellen," with tears in her voice. The young girl then broke free from my brother and ran towards the woman, calling out "Mother." Just then, a man on horseback rode past and shouted, "They are coming." A coachman followed behind, yelling, "Move out of the way there." My brother then noticed a closed carriage turning into the lane. As the horse approached, people crowded together, trying to avoid it. My brother and I pushed the pony and chaise back into the hedge, allowing the man on the horse to pass. He then stopped at the turn of the road. It was a carriage with a pole for 2 horses, but only one was in the harness. Through the thick dust, my brother could barely see 2 men taking something out on a white stretcher and carefully placing it on the grass under the privet hedge. Suddenly, one of the men ran towards my brother. The man who had approached my brother asked desperately, "Where can I find some water? Lord Garrick is dying fast and is very thirsty." My brother was shocked to hear that it was Lord Garrick, the Chief Justice. He replied, "There might be a water tap in some of the nearby houses, but we don't have any water with us. I can't leave my people alone." The man then pushed through the crowd towards the gate of the corner house, hoping to find water. The people urged him on, shouting, "Keep going. They're coming. Keep moving." My brother's attention was drawn away by a man with a beard and a sharp, eagle-like face. The man was carrying a small handbag that suddenly split open, spilling out a large amount of gold coins. The coins scattered and rolled around among the feet of horses and men who were struggling in the chaos. The man stood still, staring dumbly at the heap of coins. Suddenly, the shaft of a passing cab hit him on the shoulder, causing him to stumble backward, and a cartwheel nearly hit him. The people around him shouted, "Get out of the way," as they tried to avoid trampling him. As soon as the cab passed, the man threw himself onto the pile of coins, shoving handfuls of them into his pockets. A horse suddenly charged towards him, and before he could move, the man was knocked down and trampled by the horse's hooves. I yelled "Stop!" and pushed a woman aside to reach for the horse's bit. But before I could grab it, I heard a scream and saw the wheel of the cart run over the poor person's back. The cart driver then whipped his horse at me, so I ran behind the cart. The loud shouting made it hard to hear. The person who got run over was lying in the dust with his money scattered around him. He couldn't get up because the wheel had broken his back and his legs were lifeless. I stood up and called out to the next driver passing by, and a man on a black horse came to help me. "Let's get him out of the way," he said, and grabbed the injured man's collar while I pulled him sideways. But he still clung onto his money and stared at me fiercely, hitting my arm with a handful of gold. Angry voices from behind told us to keep moving. "People, make way," the men around me shouted. Suddenly, a carriage crashed into the cart in front of us, causing a loud smash. As I looked up, I saw the man with the bag of gold twist his head and bite my wrist. I felt a concussion, and the black horse staggered sideways while the cart horse pushed beside it. I released my grip on the man and jumped back just as a horse's hoof barely missed my foot. The fallen man's face turned from anger to terror as I was carried past him and backward in the chaos. As I fought to regain control of the pony, I saw Miss Elphinstone covering her eyes, and a child staring in wonder at a crushed object in the road. "Let's go back," I shouted, turning the pony around. "We can't cross this ... hell," I said, and we retreated 100 yards to escape the fighting crowd. As we passed the bend in the lane, I saw the dying man's face in the ditch, pale and shining with sweat. The 2 women with me sat silently, crouching and shivering. After retreating from the chaotic scene, my brother, Miss Elphinstone, and her sister-in-law were all in distress. I was both horrified and confused. I knew that attempting to cross the street was urgent and necessary, so I turned to Miss Elphinstone and made up my mind. "We have to go that way," I said, and led the pony back around. Miss Elphinstone proved her bravery once again. I jumped into the street, stopping a cab horse while she drove the pony in front of it. A wagon briefly collided with us, splintering a piece off the carriage. In no time, we were carried along by the flow of people. With the cabman's whip marks on my face and hands, I scrambled into the driver's seat and took the reins from Miss Elphinstone. He handed her the revolver and instructed her to point it at the man behind or his horse if they were pressed too hard. He then tried to find a chance to move to the right side of the road. But once they entered the crowded street, he felt powerless and caught up in the chaos. They were carried along with the crowd, passing through Chipping Barnet, and it took almost a mile before they reached the other side of the town. The noise and chaos were beyond words. But as they left the town, the road forked several times, which made it a bit easier to navigate. We headed eastward through Hadley and encountered a large group of people on both sides of the road, gathered around a stream and fighting to get to the water. We encountered another large group of people farther on, near East Barnet, and saw 2 trains moving slowly, one after the other, packed with people, including some riding on the coal behind the engines. These trains were heading northward along the Great Northern Railway without any signal or order. I think the trains must have been packed with people who couldn't get into the central termini due to the chaos and fear. We stopped for the rest of the afternoon near this spot because we were all exhausted from the day's violence. We were all beginning to feel hungry, but we didn't dare to sleep in the cold night. In the evening, we saw many people hurrying along the road in the direction from which we had come, fleeing from unknown dangers ahead of them.